Okay.
Ben? Yeah.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm so sure I don't need the mic, but welcome to Liberal Judaism. For any of you who don't know me, and I'm pretty sure I know most of you in the room, I am Rabbi Charlie Baginski. I'm Liberal Judaism's Director of Strategy and Partnerships. This is our third in our series of what we call hot potatoes. We believed here at Liberal Judaism that we needed to create a space that we could have civilised dialogue on some of the more difficult subjects, and that we needed to be a place where the polarised conversation, the way that people talk to each other didn't come into this building, and that actually we could still talk about some of the topics that we do want to engage with and that are difficult to talk about. And so we created the space that is Hot Potatoes. I'm really excited that the third in our series is on faith schools. You'll see on your chairs that the next one is on dignity and dying. We will have a very exciting panel just like this panel is exciting for our next one. And so if you enjoyed tonight, please come and support us with the next one. And with no further ado, I will hand over to our fantastic chair, to Keith Kahn-Harris, who is going to try and guide us through tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Charlie. Don't call me a fantastic chair until I've actually chaired.
Yeah, I've seen you.
Okay, thanks. Very nice here to be here this evening. I'm going to introduce all four of our speakers. This isn't going to be like a formal debate, but that said, there are two people on each side. But no one's going to be taking a vote or anything like that unless you really want to. So we have four speakers tonight. We have our furthest right is Patrick Moriarty. Exactly.
Only in terms of position.
Yes, in terms of position is Patrick Moriarty. Patrick
on your left, possibly.
Patrick is the headmaster of Jewish Community Secondary School, aka JCoSS, and is also an ordained priest or ordained priest. You explained to me the difference a while back between a curate and a deacon and a priest, but I've totally forgotten.
It's disappointing.
It's disappointing. Anyway, the point is it's part-time, and he's not a Catholic priest. He is married and has children. Okay. Then speaking second will
That's the best introduction I've ever
had. So I told you, Charlie, you really shouldn't.
I took him off now.
Next to Patrick, we have Jeremy Rodell. Jeremy is the Dialogue Officer for Humanists UK, formerly called the British Humanist Association, I think it was. And then we have Helena Miller. Helena is here today in her capacity of Director of the Jewish Life study, which is, she'll explain what it is when she speaks, and it's a longitudinal study of young people in Jewish schools. Helena was also the instigator of the project that became JCoSS as well. And last but not least, we have Pete Tobias, Rabbi Pete Tobias. Peter is the rabbi of Elstree Liberal Synagogue and a fellow Watford supporter, so I will not be biased towards him, I promise. Okay, so let battle commence, not that it's a battle. With Patrick.
Thank you very much. I'm really interested to hear you say there are kind of two people on each side, because I'm now trying to figure out which side am I. But maybe that will set a particular tone. I'll tell you how I connect to this topic. I have taught in a number of schools in North London over the last 30 years. Hard to believe, isn't it? Started when I was 10, and away we go. And actually none of those schools has been a normal school, whatever that might mean. One of them was selective grammar school, one of them was a Church of England comprehensive school, one of them was an independent selective girls' school, and now this one, JCoSS, by far the best of them all, is a selective by faith but not by ability, so a Jewish comprehensive school. And to go back to the question of which side I'm on, I feel a bit conflicted, to be honest. Having never taught in a school that's simply serves a community on the basis of a catchment area, which is the closest we've got in this country to a non-selective school. I feel my heart is very much in faith schools, even though my head says if you were starting a system of education from scratch, you probably wouldn't do it that way. And that leaves me in a kind of a bit of a quandary. I love them. I think they work, although I'm conscious that, as I say, I think they work. Obviously, they work for the people who are in them, and that may be, to some extent, at the expense of the people who are not in them. Their great advantage, and I've had discussions with people who, possibly like others we will hear this evening, are kind of fundamentally ideologically opposed to them. I'll recount the conversation, because it was with someone of about my age, but children of a similar sort of age, who said, I just can't understand why anybody would think that a faith school is a good idea. Where do your children go? I asked her, and she said, well, we go to a school in, and I can't quite remember where it was some sort of charter school where the parents had paid a certain amount of money to top up the state funding, with effectively the result that it was a school for people like her and their children. So, with that in mind, from somebody who was a passionate disagreeer with, passionate advocate against faith schools, what seemed to me was going on was that she was against the notion that anyone could choose a school in relation to faith values, but absolutely in favour of choosing a school in favour of her own set of, whether it was social values or political values or some kind of proxy demographic selection so that you could be with people a bit like you. And when I look at it like that, I think that's a really socially divisive way to run an education system. But it's exactly what faith schools do. The beauty of it is it allows the fostering of values. It allows the notion that within a state-maintained system, the state will fund, will support, both capital-wise and revenue-wise, schools that suit the various pluralistically held value systems of the people in the population. And that, to me, is a very beautiful idea. It's a very wonderful sort of pluralist, democratic, social idea that the state doesn't just say, there's one size fits all and you suck it up. The state says, no, we are a diverse place and we want to provide schools that are diverse. And that does seem to me very, very wonderful. A side point about selection in general. So I say I've never taught in a school that didn't have some element of selection, be it by faith, be it by income, be it by ability, or some combination of all of the above. There are clearly amazing things you can do in a school when you have a concentration of talent. And the question always is the advantage you can get when you concentrate a particular set of talents or a particular type of person, does that outweigh what that steals from the rest of the community? I don't know the answer to that. But anyway, that is the pro, that is the advantage of a faith school. The disbenefit I've kind of already hinted at, that it ends you up getting to the age of 18 and never having met someone who's not like you. Possibly even getting to the age of 21, if you go to a university with a large Jewish community, you may actually exist within a Jewish bubble until the age of 21 and not even know that that's the case. And that is not good for the cohesion of society. On top of that, I'll put a con in, because I'm trying to be very balanced, I'll put a con in, which is, it seems to me hard to disagree with the fact that the Jewish schools in London are used as a proxy for, Jewishness is used as a proxy for good schools. If you look at the Sunday Times, the Times list of the top comprehensives in the country, number 1 for A-level this year is a school in the Boreham Wood area. Number 3 is JCoSS, and number 4 is a school in the Kingsbury area. So 3 of the top 4 schools nationally, non-selective schools, are all Jewish. it tells you something about, are these schools good? Are they perceived as good? But also, is something else probably going on in terms of social selectiveness, in terms of academic selectiveness, or in terms of a selectiveness on the grounds of kind of parental buy-in and families that put a high value on education. Now, is that a bad thing that you're allowed to select on that basis, whether kind of explicitly or implicitly? Again, I don't know. What I do know is, at its best, it works brilliantly well. And I will pitch for what I mean by at its best, which needless to say is a school rather like mine, where there is a recognisable group of people who have something very common about their identity. So there's a real binding together of people on the basis of shared values. They hold those values in very, very different ways. It isn't a monochrome, monocultural school exactly, because there are all sorts of different ways of being Jewish. Within the curriculum is an absolutely explicit commitment to reaching out, making links with other faiths. Hell, my school even employs a priest as a head teacher. That's how committed they are to interfaith. That's not a serious point, but we do have a very explicit, dedicated programme of not just, we'll get a Muslim in every now and then to kind of tick the box, but actually we will do social action projects with Muslim schools. We will do really quite intentional and well-developed schemes to make sure that our students are mixing not only with children at faith schools of other denominations, but at other schools of no denomination at all. We also work very hard in areas where some faith schools find it more difficult to align themselves with sort of secular culture. So on issues like diversity of every possible kind. Why? Because our students insisted that we were. So the idea that you put lots of Jews together and they just become even looking and just retreat into their shells does not appear to be borne out by our experience. They want. Many of our students have come from non-Jewish primary schools, they've had it there, and they want to continue that. How am I doing, Keith, time-wise? Am I nearly there?
I think you're there.
Shall I stop? I don't think I've answered the question, except to say my head says this isn't a good way, but my heart says it really, really works, and it's a beautiful thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Do you mind if we go, I think it probably works better if we go right to left. Who finds speaking last?
You want to speak last?
Yes.
Oh,
So, next we have Jeremy Rodell, the Dialogue Officer for Humanists UK.
Thank you. Very interested in that. It was interesting that I was coming to this and just thinking about what I was going to say. And then yesterday, the Chief Rabbi put out an extremely strong statement attacking British humanists very strongly.
Chief Rabbi of the United Synagogue.
nothing to do with us.
Anyway, no, I know it's not. And I even heard somebody say, why do you need a Chief Rabbi? And a Jewish lady said, paused and said, we need someone to disagree with. And what he said was that humanism is becoming ever more competitive in the way in which regards faith communities. Now, speaking as somebody who spends a lot of time in constructive dialogue with faith communities, I can tell you that on this, the Chief Rabbi is sadly misinformed. And I think, though, as we're doing here, you've got to distinguish between sincerely held disagreement on specific things and generalised hostility. We're going to disagree, but hopefully we're not hostile with each other. And I think that attitude I found that very disappointing. And there's obviously the fact that there is a dialogue officer for Humanists UK and other people doing dialogue somewhat contradicts his point. And on schools, of course, the other important point is that among the groups who are arguing on this issue of faith schools is a group called the Accord Coalition, and the original head of that was Rabbi Jonathan Romain, and it's now headed by the Reverend Stephen Terry, who's Church of England priest. Now, I'm coming to this from the point of view of secularism as a sort of principle, and that doesn't mean atheism, important thing. And that it means three things. One is that the state is neutral. When you've got a plural society, the state should be neutral, no particular body is advantaged or disadvantaged in the institutions of the state. Secondly, very importantly, the state guarantees freedom of thought and conscience and expression, freedom of religion and belief, as long as it's not eroding the rights and freedoms of other people. And finally, that there isn't any discrimination against anybody because of their faith. So those are the three things that are, that's what if you ask a humanist, you'd say that's what secularism is. Now, and of course, when we start talking about faith schools, just to be clear, we've got to distinguish between, are we talking about the private sector, the public sector, or illegal schools? Hopefully we can all agree illegal schools, which is an issue, are a bad thing. I think I'm thinking about the public sector. And in talking about this, I'm going to say I don't like them, but it's very important to stress that that isn't denigrating the people that work in them or the people that run them. I've visited and spoken in many faith schools, including actually yours once, about 5 years ago, where I was there with a Shia Muslim speaker, I think. And the people are great, the kids are great. That isn't the point that we're talking about here. So most humanists, and many other people, of course, disagree with the principle of state-funded faith schools. And only today I saw an article which was talking about how damaging segregation in schools is to social cohesion in Glasgow, where of course it's Catholics versus Protestants. And even among people who think there should be faith schools, many object to the principle of direct or indirect selection or discrimination, I would say, in admissions and to some degree employment at state schools. That's only actually possible because there's a special exemption in our equality legislation. And we're really exceptional in this. The OECD, that sort of club of rich countries, 35 rich countries, did a report a number of years ago, and they said there are only 4 countries out of their 35 that allowed. We're one. The others were Estonia, Israel, and Ireland. And Ireland is now moving away from that. So this is really unusual, but because we're very familiar with faith-based selection, we don't see how unusual it is. So what are the problems? Anyway, why do I think this is a bad thing? Well, there are 2 really main things. One is social cohesion. Coincidentally, on Monday I was at an event at Kingston Liberal Synagogue, which brought together an Israeli and a Palestinian peace activist, both young women. And the Palestinian one currently is working and studying in London. And she was saying how great it is being in this city, because basically everyone rubs along and it sort of works. And I'm very proud of that. I think London's a fantastic city from that point of view. We should all be very proud of that. But we know, of course, that there are still tensions. And we also know, and there were some formal reports about this, there was a thing called the Campbell Report, about 10 years ago, about riots in the northern cities, and there was a more recent Casey report, that we know that segregating children by faith or ethnicity in separate schools is bad for social cohesion. It leads to more people, not everybody, good schools of course are acting against it, as you rightly said, it leads to more people, is seeing people who are different, not as somebody that they're working, living with and encountering every day, but as potentially a dehumanised other over there. And we all know where that can be. It's a very dangerous thing. And that's damaging both to the whole of society and, of course, to the minority groups affected. It's certainly not going to help the worrying problem we have on anti-Semitism. Now, it's a two-way street, social cohesion. Rabbi Jonathan Romain said, I want my children to go to a school when they can sit next to a Christian, play football at the break with a Muslim, do homework with a Hindu, and walk back with an atheist, interacting with them, and them getting to know what a Jewish child is like. Schools should build bridges, not erect barriers. So that's the social cohesion. The other bit is about fairness and equality. There's a lot of research about this. And we know that faith-based selection is in practice social selection. That's what happens with faith-based selection. I thought Catholic schools were bad because I've campaigned about it. Preparing for this, I looked at some of the data. Jewish schools actually are really bad on this. And yes, of course, faith schools are on average, educationally, academically, really good. But the data shows that that superior performance, on average, you can't say it's school by school, on average is attributable to the social selection on their intake. You get a good intake, you get a good output. You know, it's no accident that there's the phrase on your knees to save the fees, you know, among people. There was a study on the Fair Admissions campaign uses free school meals as an indicator of deprivation. And they looked across all the Jewish primaries and secondaries in the country. And normally you would expect the number of kids with free school meals in a school to roughly map what it is in that community. You know, local, you could say local authority, area, postcode. In the case of the Jewish schools, they were only, the number of kids eligible for free school meals were only 20 to 25% of what they were in their local community. That's a huge, huge difference, far bigger than any other sort of school. And that may, you might say, well, that reasonably reflects if the Jewish population happens to be, on average, more prosperous. Nothing wrong with that, of course, and that may just reflect it. But the effect is to deny choice and access for the other parents and children to local state-funded schools. And of course, there's an element of ethnic selection as well. Now, from my point of view, it simply can't be right for a child to be denied access to a state-funded school, especially a good one, simply because of its parents' religion or belief. You know. Now, those who benefit from it, of course, want to keep it. That's fair enough. Now, the chief rabbi, the chief rabbi claims that for us, the Jewish community, he's talking about education means our future. Do I not have the right to educate my children in accordance with the values that I hold dear, etc., etc.? Yes, of course he does. Of course he does. But that doesn't give him the right to demand that the state provides or finances that education, especially when its exclusivity has negative impacts on other people and, as Jonathan remains, in the wider society. All children, including Jewish children, also have the right to be able to make informed decisions about what they think and, you know, have the information that they need. And if you're worried about passing on values, the Muslim community is much bigger than the Jewish community. Far lower proportion of Muslim kids go to Muslim schools than Jewish kids go to Jewish schools. Yet there isn't, nobody's talking about a crisis of assimilation among the Muslim community. So, you know, it's simply wrong to claim that parents sending their children to community schools are unable to educate their children in their faith. Millions of parents do that. And schools all over the country cater for their children's dietary and other needs fine. So I don't think it's a good idea.
And now to Helena Miller.
Right. It's very tempting to respond, but actually I'm going to keep to my brief and maybe just say a few things as we go along. Right, okay. So, where to start? So, I've had a career in education, in non-Jewish schools for 10 years as an art teacher, and then moved into an academic role and have worked over decades working with teachers and on professional development and initial teacher training and master's degrees in Jewish education in the Jewish sector, across the whole of the Jewish sector, not just in the Reform or Liberal or Masorti movements, but also in the Orthodox world. And I, apart from thoroughly disagreeing with what you said, I'm afraid, what I'm doing at the moment, which I'm going to tell you about, is a longitudinal study. A longitudinal study is where you go year on year studying the same population. I am studying all of the children, not I on my own, but with a team. I lead a study which is looking at all of the children and their families who started Jewish secondary schools. Every 2 years since 2011, we've been going back to these families, we survey them, we have a large interview group, and we have been really looking and charting and exploring how these children navigate their way through their faith school experience, and really trying to see how they interact with the world, how they relate to their Jewish education. We have a massive data, as you can imagine. We have around 1,000 young people. And we are now in the second phase of the project where these young people have left school. So I actually brought you a free gift. This is a report that we've done of the first 7 years of the study. I suppose luckily it's not a large audience because there's enough for one for everybody. Please do feel free to take it with you. I'm just going to focus on a couple of the outcomes of our study so far that maybe point to some of the reasons why faith schools, I think, in this country sometimes get a very bad press unnecessarily from various quarters. So first of all, one of the accusations about faith schools is that young people in faith schools, they're in a bubble, they're insular. I can tell you that from our research, that's not true. We asked our young people, for example, in the last time we went to see them, which was just before they left school in year 13, they were either 18 or coming up for 18, we asked them, are you planning to vote in the next election? This would have been the first time that these young people would have been able to vote. Across all our schools, and there was no difference between JCoSS on the left, if you like, of the kinds of schools we had, and Helena, which is on the right, there was no difference. 90% on average of the young people in our schools plan to vote in the next general election. When the national survey asked young people across the UK, not related to faith schooling, what percentage were planning to vote in the next election, it was around 70%. So I think that shows a very healthy interest in what's going on around them from our young people, aged 18. Now, we don't know how many actually got out of bed the day that they were first allowed to vote and actually made it to the polling station, but just the fact that we have such a high percentage of young people interested in engaging with the world. Now, with our interview families, we have 130 interview families, we were able to probe much more deeply about the kinds of things they're interested in the world, the kinds of volunteering that they are doing that go beyond the Jewish community. And I think you would be really proud of the young people that we have who are graduates of the Jewish school system in this country. They do want to engage in the world. They are able to cope outside of the Jewish schooling system. They do know how to conduct themselves because they live in a multicultural society. They engage on a day-to-day level, if nothing else, through all the social media and through television and through all the other ways that society comes to them. They don't have to go very far. And I think that that is testament to one of the reasons why faith schools really are definitely not a bad thing. I'd like to say just a couple of other things about this study. The majority of young people in this country do not take gap years anymore. Any of the people in the room who work for a movement or UJA or anywhere else will know that the percentages have plummeted. Gap years were traditionally a way that the Jewish community really grew the next generation of communal leaders, because after a year in Israel, the young people were really much more able to take leadership roles and so on. But I happen to know the person who is the director of UJS, the Union of Jewish Students, and they are working very hard to ensure that there is preparation for campus that not only looks at the leadership of the young people who are leaving our Jewish schools, but is also ensuring that they are able to take their full part in university life and to integrate very successfully within a university context. We asked the young people when they were 18 in our study, we asked them to tell us about why they chose the universities that they had chosen. This was before they'd got their results, but they'd all by that time had their offers. And again, we were surprised. We assumed that they would go to university because their friends were going, or because it was a university where there was a very large number of Jewish students. Surprisingly, our young people choose their university choices because of the subjects they might study. And what a surprise that might be. Actually, we should, again, our young people are confident in their Jewish identity because that's one of the things they've got from their years of Jewish schooling. And once you are confident in your own identity, you can then go out into the world and engage very successfully in a much broader context. And I think one of the things that we have seen through our research so far is that one of the things that Jewish schools do really well is develop in young people a very strong sense of self, who they are Jewishly. And that may be the same as their families, it may be different from their families, it may not be exactly the same as the Jewish studies departments in the schools are kind of trying to embed in them, but they will decide how they are going to be as young adult Jews. And they're very confident in that, and they're very engaged with community. Just a couple of points on what the previous speakers have said, and then I'm going to stop. So firstly, the crisis of assimilation of the Muslim population. I have to say a word about this, and Keith, as a researcher, may say something as well.
I'll do.
No. This is only a demographic numbers thing.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Right. The Jewish community has been in the UK in large numbers since the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. We are 4 or 5 generations away from those very traditional Orthodox Jews that came out of Eastern Europe. And successive generations have been less able to really hang on to their Jewish background, culture, identity, and so on, without some help from schools and communities. The Muslim population in the UK is not as many generations resident in the UK, and my feeling is that that is one of the reasons why they still have a very cohesive educational framework outside of day school education. I would be really interested to see what happens in the Muslim community in 2 generations' time or 3 generations' time. My guess is that it won't be very different from now. And the final comment I'm going to make is about choice. I completely agree with what Patrick started with. We all make choices for our children, whether it's nursery school, primary school, secondary school. I would hazard a guess that very few people in this room who have children sent them to the local comprehensive school. Some of you will have done. I'm not saying nobody, but the majority of the Jewish community, and we've seen this through our study, the majority of the Jewish community who do not choose Jewish schools send their children to selective schools. They send them to single-gender schools, or they send them to academically selective schools, or they send them to fee-paying schools, because they want to have a choice, quite rightly, and why not? So I am not going to have a go at any of you for sending your child to a public school or a single-gender school or any other kind of school that you choose. So please respect those of us who choose Jewish schools for our children.
And now it's Pete, round off the panel.
Thank you. My focus is slightly different. It comes from the position of being a congregational rabbi, and particularly a rabbi of a liberal congregation, a congregation in the liberal movement. And it's a very curious position to be in. As far as I'm concerned, as a former primary school teacher, my understanding of education has always been that it doesn't really matter what environment it takes place in. The issue is the individual children and their development. Unfortunately, the introduction of the national curriculum and a whole bunch of other things since I left teaching 30-something years ago means that theory is sort of slowly disappearing out the window, and children are being much less regarded as individuals and much more as statistics and things to help your school get higher up a particular league table, which I may or may not come back to. Just a couple of anecdotes about my early experiences of Jewish schools, which probably set me fairly firmly against them in the very early days. I started my rabbinic career in Birmingham, and my son was coming up to nursery age. So we dutifully decided that he ought to go to the King David School in Moseley, which was where the Jewish community had lived in large numbers about 50 years earlier. but from where they'd all more or less entirely emigrated to climes further south and into Solihull, and a large Muslim population had moved into the area of Moseley. Nevertheless, some of the parents sent their kids to the King David School, and the rest of the places were taken up by the local Muslim kids. And it was always exactly 50-50. And I was invited to go to visit the school. Actually, I was visiting the youth leader who operated a class or a youth building just next to the school. It was just prior as well, this time of year, coming up to High Holy Days. And I was chatting to him, and he said, oh, we lend this room out to the school because they need extra classroom space at this time of year. And there's this wonderful rendition of Eden Marcana coming from this room, and I thought, that's fantastic. So I thought, I'll just pop my head round the door and congratulate the kids on their wonderful singing. And not one of them was Jewish. And you think, what is the point of that? And then just to round it off, while my son was enjoying his time in nursery school, but I hasten to say, not taking part in this particular Hanukkah play, where we had the situation where, without exception, all the Jewish kids were the Maccabees, and all the non-Jewish kids were the Greeks. Judah the Maccabee raises his sword and says, God is on our side, and all the non-Jewish kids just fall down. So we thought, there's no way he's going to that school. So he went to, he did this nursery year, and then he went to Bourneville Primary School. And then, as some of you may recall, there was the Supreme Court case in, I think it was about 2009, where, I won't go through the whole details, you know that the Supreme Court eventually decided that there had to be a better way of enabling non-Jewish kids to get into Jewish schools. And the way they came up with was this brilliant idea of, if you attend a synagogue, any synagogue, or you and your child, if it's a child going to a secondary school, a certain number of times in a certain period when you're in year 5 and early in year 6, then you have a better opportunity to get into a Jewish school come the following September. So we had, and this always ran from May to October. So we then had this brilliant situation, which has gotten better with the passing of time, where the last Friday in April, maybe 3 or 4 people might turn up to Friday to that service. The first Friday in May, we've got 75 people, parents and kids, because they all want these points. And they love the service, and it's great to have that big a congregation, and except that for many of them, they've never been in a synagogue before, even though they're already 11 years old, or 10 or 11 years old. The parents haven't been in the synagogue since they were bar mitzvah, 15, 20 years earlier. And so nobody really knows what's going on. But at least you've got people in the building. And then, of course, the irony is that they get their place at the Jewish school. This is Jewish and non-Jewish kids, but mostly Jewish kids I'm talking about here. They no longer need to attend the synagogue because they don't need points anymore. And they get the day off for all the Jewish holidays because the Jewish schools are closed for the Jewish holidays, and they all go to Alton Towers for the day. To the point where, I mean, it was and initially they were very pleased with this option because they used to be off-peak, so they used to get in cheap. But they got smart to this, and Alton Towers and Thorpe Park and all of them now sit down at the start of the year, work out when the Jewish holidays are, and whack full peak prices on the Jewish holidays. So, and what is the effect on the community, or my community for that? My jaw would have dropped. I don't know if Charlie noticed when she was saying something, the number of kids in the religious school that she runs in South Bucks, which is...
Frankie,
25.
25, you said 50.
No, we run one and our couple at Torah, yeah.
Right. Okay, we struggle to get to double figures in a religious school now because all the kids presumably say to their parents on the Sunday morning, well, we've already done it for 5 days a week, we're going to do this stuff for again on a Sunday. So now they're not coming to services, they're not coming to religion school, they dutifully turn up for their bar or bar mitzvah year because they have to, because if they don't, we won't let them celebrate becoming bar or bar mitzvah. But they don't know what they're doing. And even in that situation, that environment, there's a fantastic situation where in my bar and bar mitzvah class, I've got a class which is half kids who are at Jewish schools and half kids who are at secular schools, state schools. So half of them think that God wrote the Torah and it's all true, and the other half don't even know what it is, which is, again, an interesting balance. And when it comes to the ceremony itself, the kids who are at the Jewish schools, of course, invite all their mates, and their mates have been to everybody else's bar or bar mitzvah during the whole year, so they just behave outrageously, almost without exception. And yet the kids from the non-Jewish schools are so respectful and so interested and so completely engaged in what's going on. I mean, so I just think that one of the things that goes on in Jewish schools, either that's maybe deliberate, that's not fair, but as perhaps an accidental consequence, is a level of arrogance and a level of disrespect and dismissiveness on the part of the children and the parents towards the synagogue community. Now maybe it's just being a liberal synagogue, I don't know, maybe they sit as good as gold in the local Orthodox synagogue, I'm fairly sure they don't, but that, maybe I should just say that. And it is the effect on, I'm talking specifically a small, well, as a liberal synagogue goes to be one of the larger ones, as one of the synagogues in the Bournemouth Elstree area, we're still not the largest by any means. And in a whole variety of ways, my synagogue has become a victim of what goes on in the Jewish schools. And to the extent that, as I say, they're not taking part. I mean, interestingly, for the first time I can remember, we've got all the kids in the Kabbalah Torah group this year actually are at Jewish schools. There's 3 at JCoSS and 1 at Loveday. And the geographical situation is that we're right smack in that Jewish school territory. I don't want to talk about the Jewish school that is closest to us, particularly because there are various opinions about that one that probably aren't worth sharing here. One of the other things that liberal Judaism is failing to do, I'm not sure why that is or how that happens, is make a real impact, LJY, make an impact on the kids from liberal synagogues in the Jewish schools. They're just not there. So the only Jewish, when it comes to Israel year, when it comes to summer camp, they're all with their mates, and they've got a very, the reform movement is much more prominent in it seems to be in some way getting these kids engaged. So most of the liberal kids jump ship and go to Shemesh and go on RSY tour to Israel. It's true. It's 100% true. You can sit and disagree with that. I'll show you the figures. And from my shul, okay, when I actually had the director of this movement, the executive director, saying to me, "Why are you encouraging all your kids to go on Shemesh?" Like I'm going to do that as a former Kadima. But anyway. And it's just something else that has become, how long have I got? How am I doing?
You've got about a minute or so.
Right. One of the great things that comes out of the Bar Mitzvah class is the kids from the very Orthodox Jewish school. It was one who used to come up to me at the end of each lesson, and I'm going to quote directly, who said, "Please can you tell me something else about what really happened in Jewish history so that I can tell my Jewish studies teacher and really piss him off." That was one of my roles as the rabbi of the mitzvah class. But I also question, this is the last thing I'll say on this, and it's based on something that I heard at a debate just such as this, at a panel discussion at Limud about 4 or 5 years ago, or maybe it was too early in your study for it to have registered yet. And there was someone there who ran a gap year program in Israel, and he said, "We have kids from all over the English-speaking Jewish world coming on our gap year program." He says the American kids are very Jewishly knowledgeable. We're not talking about Hebrew ability, I'm talking about knowing what the Mishnah is, that kind of stuff. And he said the American kids are around about level Hay, the South Africans, the Australians about level Gimel, and the British kids aren't even on the scale, they're below Aleph. They don't know anything. So I don't know what the hell is being taught in Jewish studies in these schools, but it isn't rubbing off on the kids. That's my experience. I'm not saying that they're all that way. That's my experience of what's happening to my synagogue and my kids in my synagogue as a consequence of Jewish schools in the area. Thank you.
Right, so 4 very different perspectives. I'm sure we're going to have an interesting discussion, and I think we'll open it up to the floor now, and I think before the end we'll go back to our 4 panellists so they can have a final word, perhaps in the opposite order. Okay. No one wants to say anything? Fine. Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
The discussion is meant to be about faith-based school or faith schools. What actually we've talked about is almost all the time Jewish schools. Now, the way things, in terms of state funding in this country, Church of England, Catholic, Jewish schools are state funded. The majority, if you wanted to try and create a Muslim faith, a Muslim school that is state funded, you're going to have a problem. They're very limited. But I think if we're looking at this issue, we have to sort of think what is source of the abuse, source of the ganda. If we're going to have religious, faith-based schools for one religion, we have to do them for all. How do we actually feel as a country if we have Jewish schools for Jewish kids, Muslim schools for Muslim kids, Hindu schools for Hindu kids. You get the point.
What about Buddhist?
Evangelical schools for evangelical children, and the list could go on. I just can't see how that's a good thing. That feels to me, and I share sort of Jeremy's reservation, but I just can't see how that is going to lead to any form of social cohesion, or even the kind of society that I think probably most of us will live in. And I think it's a limitation to just think about this from the perspective of Jewish schools. Anything that we say here, we have to apply. Would we say we want to see that replicated across all the faiths in this country? And I think
Okay,
we
so
haven't thought about
thanks
it.
very much. So what about that wider perspective? And I think we might add to that also the issue of Haredi schools in the Jewish world as well, to sort of expand it. Who would like to take that? Maybe Patrick or Helena first?
Yeah,
Patrick.
and you echoed some of my reservations. And my question, I suppose, is what does make a better society? Is it better that we allow children to be thoroughly steeped in a set of values at home, at school, and in their communities, and hope that by giving them a really strong sense of identity, they will then confidently rub up against others when they get into the wider world? Is that a better model? Or is it a better model to say, no, we'll make them all rub up against each other at school? I think there are pros and cons. I mean, I entirely agree, and to pick up your point about, some more extreme religious schools, be it Jewish extremes or Muslim extremes or Christian extremes, which, speak for myself, I find the most terrifying of all, but then I would deny as a Christian. I've got worries about those, and I certainly would want to say there has to be a very strong commitment. State funding means national curriculum or something like it. But as to which is the better overall model, I think there are pros and cons.
Okay, any other response? I would imagine Jeremy might want to say something.
Well, obviously, you reckon that, but I agree with you. I think the other point to make is that, I'm not a teacher. I don't spend my time in schools, but I do visit schools. I speak in schools, and anyone that says that kids don't have different identities and strong, confident identities based on their backgrounds is wrong. If you go into a school, people have very strong, and they will ask. I go in as a human speaker or on a panel as a human speaker. You get very challenging questions. But somebody says, "Well, my faith. This is what we think. What do you think of that?" So I don't see this as a danger. People are getting that, but they're also getting the fact that they can say that, and then the person sitting next to them has a different background, and that's okay. And it seems to me, well, that's really a point.
And one of the assumptions that's been made here is one about, well, there's two. One is about the homogeneity of pupils in Jewish schools, which a question, where is the evidence for that? Given that they are pulled from all different backgrounds, including socio-economic backgrounds, they're pulled from different countries, they're pulled from, I could go on. The other is more pertinent to the research that I've done with adolescents, and that is, where is your emphasis, where is your evidence that if you go to a particular school that is so-called mixed, that you will actually mix certain catchment areas? For example, my local school that my son didn't get into is 75%, it happens to be a generic school, but in a generic state school, 75% of a particular faith. So to say that it is an open and doesn't actually have some sort of bias in it, I think does a disservice. But I'm more interested in looking at the adolescent maps nowadays, and they are much more connected with people across entire communities, and their social landscape takes in a lot of different connections. So to speak of them as in a bubble might have applied in the 70s, 80s or 90s, but now, what is your evidence that these people have such an inward-looking network that they are harmed. What's your evidence?
So, Pete, I think that was
Okay, well,
partly directed to you.
sure. Well, I mean, the only thing I can draw on is the two schools that are closest to my synagogue. One is JCoSS, and I think it's in a different category. But the other one, which I won't mention by name, you can work it out for yourself. A significant number of the kids who left there last year, all without exception, and I'm not sure how much time they spent looking at the prospectus of that particular university, but they all went to Nottingham Trent University, which is the latest destination for the Hertfordshire Jewish school elite, and they go and they occupy the same area and they still have the same social group that they did when they were growing up with at school, almost without exception. So that, okay, it's only anecdotal, and I don't have the evidence in terms of analysing everybody's direction of where they go after they leave school. But from what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing in my area, that's very much the case that they create a bubble in Boreham Wood and then they take it with them to Nottingham.
Helena?
Yes. I think, as a researcher, I think one of the more irritating factors is when people are anecdotal and make their anecdotes sound as if, I've known people for many years, and when they make their anecdotes sound as if they're research, which is not quite true. That's been polite.
No, fair enough.
Okay. I think that the Jewish schools are really not homogeneous. If you spend any time in any of the large comprehensive Jewish schools, you meet a wide variety of types of student, whether it's JCoSS or JFS or any of the other large comprehensives. Just to comment on the comment that people who are in, now I can't remember who it was who made the comment, but that young people, oh, it was you, Peter, saying yes, this points for schools and you get a large number of people in your shul. I think, I've said this before in various venues, I think that the relationship between Jewish schools and shuls needs looking at, because actually you can't live in the 1970s in your shul where everybody came to your Cheder or religion school, whatever you call it. That actually we've moved on 40 years from there, more than 40 years, nearly 50 years. Shuls need to think about how they're going to engage young people who go to Jewish schools. You know, you had a captive audience of 75 people on your Friday night service. What did you do to keep them there? Right, exactly. So that's a good thing. But, you know, don't moan that your Cheder is half empty. Just find another way of getting them into the shul.
Briefly, Jeremy, and then we'll
come back. Helen, I think you ducked the question I posed, which is, would you with equal enthusiasm advocate faith schools for all the variety of faiths in this country, which would lead to Jewish kids going to Jewish schools?
Okay, I'll just say one sentence.
You've just gone back to talking about Jewish
sentence.
When we were dealing with this question, so
The largest group in this country is secular, actually. So the biggest number of schools would actually be secular schools, if we did that.
Well, that's not an answer.
No.
It's really, it's a very, if I may say, it's a vitally important
Right,
question.
okay.
What's the
It's
chance
not,
is it because
it's
of the
not,
church?
it's a fictitious answer, because you would then have to be racing around making sure everybody lived in the right places and could get to all these schools. Life in the UK is very imperfect in so many ways, but particularly socially and particularly economically. It's not a practical question to even ask. That's my answer to you.
Jeremy, what
Just on this question, because I agree very much with what you said, that you know, anecdote isn't data. You're quite right. But you know, I've got plenty of data, and the data, although of course there's diversity, because you can measure diversity in all sorts of different directions. But if you look at socioeconomic deprivation, and if you look at ethnicity, the data are crystal clear. You can entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own data. So, you know, I can give you the data. They are just there.
Okay. Data about what?
So it shows you that for the, here's a chart for instance, this is, you probably can't see it, I didn't do it, but if you look at the degree of faith-based selection versus the percentage of using free school meals as a proxy for deprivation, which is what the government does, there is a direct line, correlation between those two. And the more faith-based selection there is, and Jewish schools are the most extreme on that, the more faith-based selection is, the lower the percentage of people with eligible for free school meals compared to the areas in which they are living in. So that there is no, of all the data that's available, some of it you can argue about, this one is, you know, bulletproof. It's really, really clear.
Okay, let's move on. Robert.
Thank you, Keith. I don't know if this is even on.
No, we can
Anyway,
do it. Press the button.
So I think there is something about the value of education that is steeped in Jewish history that means Jewish people particularly want to send their kids to good schools. And I think when you have a good head and a good school that is secular, I think there is a larger proportion of Jewish kids in it than schools that are not as good. And whether they are faith schools or not faith schools. My fundamental concern about faith schools, and I'm very on the fence because I have seen as a school governor the benefits that Jewish schools bring because they open up places to other kids that need them, and there's sometimes a dearth of places in some places that need it. But my bigger concern is not about the Jewish kids mixing with others by interfaith work that you talk about, Patrick, or other work. It's kids who never meet a Jew. And that's my concern of why we've seen anti-Semitism rise recently, because people haven't been mixing with Jews. So it's the other side of that coin. I know we're not here to talk about anti-Semitism, but that's my concern about faith schools.
Okay, so proposal there to send most Jews eventually to school in Grimsby. Sorry, I couldn't resist that one.
Yes.
Busing to Grimsby. Patrick, do you want to take that one?
Get up in the
I
morning.
will take that one because I have a lot of sympathy with that. My own schooling, I was at a school as a boy that was 30-40% Jewish, and I think I am doing what I'm doing now because of that, because I rubbed up against all sorts of boys. It was all boys' school, but boys from all sorts of different backgrounds. When my own children, who are now 25, and my oldest went to his school, a comprehensive school in Mill Hill, and you look down the list of names, and there were plenty of Jewish names there. By the time my younger daughter went, and she's now 20, so in the space of about 5 years, there were no Jewish children in that school. Why? Because JCoSS opened, and all the ones who would have gone to that school there had come to me, and that bothers me. As you say, it's not so much, it's what the non-Jews lose by not having Jews in their schools, every bit as much, if not more, than what the Jews lose by not integrating with others. So that's part of my angst about leading the school. I
just need to point out here that Patrick is, I went to the same school as Patrick did, and Patrick's probably the only person who left that school who wasn't Jewish with a positive opinion of Jews.
That's a North West London problem. It's not a problem in the rest of the country. I taught for 10 years in the London Borough of Ealing a long time ago, and basically I was always the only Jew in the building, and that's not so far away from North West London. In other parts of the country, as Keith said before, you don't go to a school where you'll meet other Jews. It's a North West London problem.
I just wanted to quote Patrick, back to Patrick, who once said to me that you grieve on the part of behalf of your daughters for the Jews they never met. I remember you saying that. So.
Okay, so
recording
I find myself agreeing with almost everything that almost everybody has said this evening. And I'm trying to work out why that is. And I think it's because actually what we're identifying is a number of different strands in this. We've talked about our faith schools, our Jewish schools. In some cases, it seems that the parents are delegating their Judaism to their kids. That the parents are happy that there's Judaism in the family because the kids are doing it at school. And therefore the families don't need to do it through the shul. That may be our particular shul. I'm at Pete's shul. I can't speak as much for others, but I see some evidence of it. And in a sense, picking up that very last point, passed from somebody else, this question of do the rest of the community rub up with Jews? Well, no, not if they are all in the Jewish schools. It's only a North West London problem. Okay, but that's where the biggest, that's the largest community of, or a very large community of Jews is. And therefore you could argue that in an area which has a high population of Jews, what we are doing is creating within that geography an element of segregation that I would argue is not great for the wider community and therefore is not great for the Jewish community. My last observation, if I may, I fundamentally, very last point, I really struggle with the point made by 2 or 3 people that the young people have a broader social spectrum because of social media. They have access to far greater resources. If they are making friends of friends of friends, they start with those friends from somewhere they started in real life. If they are in Jewish schools, I think there's a very reasonable chance, anecdotal, that the core of their friendship group will remain those with whom they spend the most physical time. That is likely to leak into their social media space as well.
Someone want to respond to that?
Yes. Is that a bad thing if Jewish people kind of have a social group that's Jewish people?
No, it is if it's exclusive. There were comments made that we shouldn't worry about it because they will get a broader perspective outside school. That's the question I have a difficulty with.
So I just wanted to say that I'd like to remind people of the history of the development of Jewish schools very briefly. That one of the main reasons that there's been such an explosion of Jewish schools across the community in the last 20 years has been because of the lack of positive outcome of the synagogue Sunday school system.
Yeah.
And in the past, parents would delegate responsibility for Jewish education to three hours a week on a Sunday morning, and that didn't work. And that's one of the reasons why Jewish schools has developed. So I think we should put that into perspective when we're having this debate.
So I just want to turn, before we go back to I just want to turn to Jeremy. Obviously, the health of the Jewish community is not your prime area of expertise. But what about that argument about that the religious groups or ethnic groups want their own schools because they're concerned about their future, and that Jewish schools, for one, might be a way of ensuring it that might not happen otherwise?
Well, I'm aware of the history, and in fact I've read your paper about supplementary schools, and I can understand that. And I know that that was a deliberate policy at the time. Just come back to the point I made about Muslim schools, that the Muslim parents are actually, Muslim structures are very good, seem to have found a formula that works for them. And, maybe others can learn from that.
You're talking about Muslim supplementary schools?
Well, among the overall structures that they do, I'm not an expert on how Muslim parents bring up their children in their faith. All you can say is that they seem, and I take your point about the generational thing, but they seem to be quite successful at doing that, and maybe there's some lessons that the Jewish community could learn from that. I don't know. But I think the thing is that it's not that there are no positives in Jewish schools, and obviously it's very good for the kids going to them, often that is the case. The question is, overall, for our society, are faith schools a good idea? And I'll just briefly mention an anecdote. It's a relevant person here. I ran a big campaign which was opposed to a local new Catholic school being set up in Twickenham. And the campaign was really about its very exclusive proposed admissions policy, which was very, basically, once it's full, if you're not a Catholic, you won't get it. And one of the people that supported the campaign, because it wasn't exclusively a humanist campaign, one of the people that supported it was actually the head teacher of one of the local community schools, who was herself a Catholic. And apart from the fact she said she was fed up with all these people that suddenly turned up to church on a certain Sunday to get the ticks in the boxes and all of that, she said the message people are arguing is this is going to be such a good school. Well, that's telling me, as a head teacher of a community school, I can't deliver a high-quality school to all the kids around. And as it happened, she's turned what was a very average school round to one where there's a queue to get in. So I think that very much addresses the point that somebody made earlier about quality. But I haven't directly answered your question.
That's fine. I think you did, actually. Pete, do you want to defend Helena?
No.
Does anybody?
Only in terms of if they think they've got it bad now, they should have been around when I was at Hayden. Anyway, that's another story.
I feel inclined
Right,
to defend Hayden as a Haydenic teacher.
Yes.
I think that, within the very limited time, on very limited resources, and we have to look at where the funding has actually gone. It's gone to the day schools. It isn't there supporting our sort of development of staff or resources. So with what we have, I think we do well. Whether we could do better, I would agree with you.
Yeah, and I think it's a bigger picture as well. It's not just about the Helena, it's about educating our congregations generally, and in a particular context in which I'm coming, it's about educating them what liberal Judaism is, because I don't think that there is enough to give our liberal Jews a liberal Jewish identity. I mean, that was true, I remember that being true in the 1980s when I was coming to the rabbinate, that our kids, there were some of our kids going off on Shnat who had no real sense of what it meant to be a liberal Jew, and came across all this stuff going on that they'd never been exposed to, like grace after meals, what's that, all these things, and they felt thoroughly humiliated by these Jews who are much more confident in their orthodox identity and practice and have no sense of what it meant to be a liberal Jew, except that you told us it wrong. That was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I think that as a liberal movement, if I assume that's the focus of, at least that's how I see my place on this panel, I think that the whole liberal movement needs to seriously look at what it's presenting to its congregants, what is liberal Judaism, and what is its message, what is its purpose in a Jewish world that is becoming more and more disparate, less and less interested in synagogue life as a whole, and the whole synagogue model has to really reshape itself.
This lady here.
So, I'm speaking as a Jewish mother. So I've always been, a member of the liberal community, always, and brought up in one. My parents took me to synagogue, or we didn't have a synagogue, but they took me to services. And we didn't use a Jewish school. We used our local primary school, our local comprehensive school. And there was a Jewish school, I could point to do now because criteria. But as a community, I think that to learn to be liberal Jew, you have to do it. And what liberal Jews do is go to synagogues. And that's what Jews do, go to synagogues. That's when you learn about the festivals. You don't, in the same way if you want to learn football, you've got to learn it on a football pitch, not in a classroom. Now, somehow, if you go to a Jewish school, I think that is subcontracting out the Jewish education of your children. And you can't do that any more than you can really do it in a Hader. Now, I then, the time when I met the parents who'd said sending kids to a Jewish school was when my son was playing football. And there was quite a shocking lack of well, it was a bar mitzvah year, but they didn't know what a parasha was. And I think on what their kid was doing there. And so I think it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Thanks. We're starting to have to speed up, so we haven't got much longer. Patrick, do you want to cover the issue about relations between synagogues and school, which has been raised in this?
I think really I want to echo what Helena said, which is that the whole thing needs rethinking. That it's a model that was devised in a different era. Whether it's, I'm not sure. I take your point about subcontracting or almost like allocating responsibility. Is that the word? Whatever it is. Take that point. But you could almost make something about the English language. It's not an either or. You do both. So the fact that you send your children to Jewish doesn't mean that you are not going to do it at all. It may make you less inclined to pick up a point that you made. I don't think it has to. But
Doesn't have to, but it does.
possibly so. Possibly so. I mean, I'm also interested. We talked about the contrast between the Muslim community and the Jewish community as a different generation. I'm also interested in the Christian dimension. There would be the very earliest national schools in this country, where were church schools. That's where it all began. So we've got 200 years on you guys. But I'm not sure we've solved the problem either. So I'm not sure that it doesn't surprise me that there needs to be a new discussion between children's school, co-centres of community, about how we're going to divide that territory up. I don't think it seems to me you can yet say this one is good, this one is bad.
So I think that could be a positive outcome of the discussion, that maybe there should be conversations about how synagogues and schools interact.
I don't know the full history of it because I arrived at Elstree 3 or 4 years after Klaus Shalom had been established. And the fact, not the specific history, and the rabbi who was really driving the project had gone down under, member of the Liberal Synagogue Elstree, which benefited the synagogue enormously. You had to have, express board sympathy with the school's pluralistic vision or something. So as long as you said, yeah, all right, you can get in, whatever you were. But I mean, the idea of having the shul next to the school, I mean, it's an interesting one, and it kind of backfires every High Holy Days as well, because of course, in the traditional way that no synagogue can ever fit all its membership into its regular building, we go to Klaus Shalom for our Holy Day services, and a lot of the kids don't want to go because they're sick of being there 5 days a week. So maybe the idea wouldn't have worked, I don't know. But,
okay.
That's it. Go for it, I think.
Okay, well, you haven't got much longer, so if we could keep make these the last 2 questions and make them fairly brief.
So I actually attended the same school as Patrick, as a non-Jewish kid growing up in a school which first Jewish education was paid to Rosh Hashanah, the school is away. And I guess my experience was that I made friends in the class before I knew what a Jew, a Muslim, etc. it really was. And had the opportunity, obviously some of those friends were Jewish friends, or had the opportunity to go to bar mitzvahs, I had the opportunity, and so forth. And I think when you grow up in that environment, you don't grow up anti-Semitic. And I guess my main concern with Patrick's talks about interfaith days, and we had the same an afternoon sort of scooting around the temple and the mosque, and I guess my question to particularly to Helena would be, how does that, how well it's developed that is at school, how does it substitute for like the education I had, which was 7 years growing up with Jewish children and getting to know them as normal people. And then just a quick follow-up. 20 years later, I'm Jewish, and treasurer of the Progressive Synagogue, and actually, contrast to Elstree, we've got a fastly growing kind of religion school, and I think that's a very, very strong thing. So, and I think that's important for the future of the synagogue. So, I guess my question is, why do we need? You said about Jewish schools and developing Jewish identity, but why do we need it? I mean, why can the synagogue, future Progressive Synagogue, is developing kids through its religious school, through its KT, with strong Jewish identity? So, I guess the question is, why do we need that?
Can I just ask, have you got a Jewish school near you in the vicinity?
So,
Is there a Jewish school?
Is there a Jewish school here?
there are primary schools and there are kids that go to.
Okay, I'm a great advocate of Jewish schools, but I'm also a great advocate of choice. And if you don't want to send your child to a Jewish school, I'm not going to make you send your child to a Jewish school until you have to. Just as you are not going to tell me my child needs to go to an independent, that's what I said before. So I think it's almost the wrong question. I think if, for many Jewish families, and we've seen this through our research, sending their child to a Jewish school has fulfilled a very important function for them. And therefore, why should that be wrong? For other children, they go to other kinds of schools, and you wouldn't say to a child who went to an academically selective school, well, actually, that's wrong necessarily. Well, some people might.
Okay.
So I think it's not about whether you should or you shouldn't.
Yeah, so my name's Eddie Gaventa, thank you for the fascinating evening. So I'm a youth worker who has worked predominantly in the Orthodox world and I've worked with, across the whole community. So a note on synagogues and young people is that whilst I work for this Orthodox synagogue, we're about middling size, we engage with 40% of our young people on a weekly basis, around 100, outside of traditional synagogue services. So if anyone would like to speak to me about new models of synagogue engagement, I'm very happy to. My question is specifically about the voice of young people. As a youth worker, it's paramount that we respect the autonomy of young people to choose for themselves on a whole range of issues, including their schooling. And this is increasingly a decision that is made in conjunction with their parents, not by their parents for them. So I'm wondering in the, and this is something that Janusz Korczak, the famed educator from the Warsaw Ghetto, that children are not the people of tomorrow, they are people today. They are not instruments of social change for adults. Where would you put the voice and choice of young people in this discussion?
So, can I suggest that we treat that as a question to it? It seems like a really nice question to end the whole thing. So why don't we start? You haven't spoken for a bit, so why don't you start and then we'll go. Actually, no comment. You, Patrick.
I don't mind being last.
Okay.
Let's end with the voice of children.
And obviously, as I mentioned, I think when you look at this, people talk about parents' rights, and I think, as I said, children's rights are also important, and children's ability to make informed choices about their lives. We haven't talked, surprisingly, I thought somebody would ask a question about relationship and sex education. That hasn't come up, but that's another area which is about ensuring children have the knowledge to live in the modern world, and then they can choose how they live their lives. So, obviously, I'm supporting that. I think there is a bit of a myth about this choice thing, because if you have an exclusive, faith-based selection, that's denying the choice for everybody who doesn't meet those criteria. Simply, if you can't afford to go to a private school, then you don't have the choice of going to one. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about choice. But I agree with you that listening to children is increasingly, of course, is an important thing to do, of course.
Patrick.
I'm absolutely all for listening to children. I do it all the time. And it's guided choice. And as you've said, the amount of guidance reduces as the child grows in maturity. It'd be interesting to know if you could somehow, in some social experiment, take children out of the orbit of their parents, what kind of school would they choose? My anecdotal sense is a lot of the children in my school truly, genuinely, they come around, they look around and they go, wow, that's the school I want to go to. I have no idea whether that's true for all of them, but they appear to be happy there, and they appear to be there because they've chosen to be there. I'll end with this point. It appears to me that the Helena School for Boys Elstree seems to win it here. Seems to. Well, is there another school with 3 people in it?
Win what?
You went to House as well.
Oh, you just the numbers of people who win. Sorry, it's just anecdotal.
What interests me is that both I and you have picked it up as there's a good model of a school where you can rub up against other people. there's two things to know about that school. One is it's both academically and economically selective. The second thing is it has a Christian foundation and a chaplain.
Yeah.
So I think my pitch to close with is there may be worse kinds of more damaging, more socially damaging forms of educational selection. So if the question is, do we want schools to be able to have distinctive values, including faith values, within a secular framework? Do we or don't we? I know there's pros and cons. I think my answer is yes, we do. But let's tighten the requirements so that their ability to do social cohesion the way that perhaps did, the way that lots of other schools I taught at perhaps girls as well, which also did it similarly. Let's make sure that the capacity of schools of religious character to understand how values work, to form those values, to get people to articulate them. That is one of the great strengths of these schools, to be inclusive, to promote social cohesion and understanding. Let's get that, and let's make sure that they don't promote a weird load of social non-appropriate values about sex education and so forth. So I think let's have faith schools, let's have good ones that are inclusive and outward.
Okay, so I feel I'm in the minority here because I didn't go to haberdashers, but there is another person in the room who went to the same school as me, so at least one. Right, so one of the questions that we asked the parents separately from the children when they left school after 7 years was, is it worthwhile, to what extent is it worthwhile attending a Jewish secondary school for 7 years? Overwhelmingly, the parents and the students felt it was worthwhile. If that is the outcome of, and there were a much more complex set of questions, but that was the kind of top line. If that's the outcome of sending your child to any school, surely what you're aiming for with your child is that they have a great experience at school and that they feel what they've done is worthwhile. If that happens, if you go to a Jewish school, to me that's a success rate.
Or any other school for that matter. I mean,
Exactly.
I'm going to finish with an anecdote. A personal one actually, which talks about, no, this is true, okay? This is a fact. I've been to haberdashers, as has just been revealed, but interestingly, given the conversation about elitism and all the rest of it, I was one of the very last kids to go in what was called the direct grant system. Which meant, I am that old, yes. Which meant that I was surrounded by these very rich kids, and I didn't have, you know, they paid hundreds of pounds a term. I paid 50p for the coaches, and that was about it. And obviously a lot of them were Jewish. I didn't identify with the Jewish kids. I found that I had nothing in common with them. I was Jewish. And so I didn't go to the Jewish assemblies or have anything to do with any of the Jewish activities that went on. So the only Jewish thing that I did, this is such a great thing to finish with, integration and knowing who's who and identity. Of course I took Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur off school, and so did all the other Jews. So, all the non-Jewish kids at haberdashers knew that I was Jewish, and all the Jewish kids didn't. I remember in my sixth form, when I said, I'll be off tomorrow, that's what this passage, who I've been with for 6 years, are you Jewish? I don't know what that tells us about identity and growing up with people, whatever, but none of my friends, not that I have many anyway, but none of the friends that I had were Jewish at haberdashers, so make what you will of that.
So I'm going to join the party and end this evening by saying the thing that haberdashers gave me was an abiding hatred of pretty much everybody who went there. But I hated them.
That's just anecdotal.
But I hated them as individuals. So maybe that's what we can hope for, a cohesive society where you hate people for their own idiosyncrasies rather than their own.